This is Bam Pow Comic Hour with your hosts, Andrew Leonard
and Chris Ramos.
And tonight we are reviewing our 70 episode review. 70th.
70. Amazing.
Amazing. Thank you to all our listeners, followers, Instagram followers, and all of that jazz. It's been a great ride. I mean, this was a COVID show that kind of just turned into a hobby that turned into, hey, it's still fun to do. And even before that, it was a radio show I did at college, and it was more fun to have a co-host with me and do different collected editions and see where it took us. And we're still doing it today. So yeah, thanks everyone. And tonight's episode, we are reviewing The Walking Dead Compendium Volume 1.
We thought this was aptly timed. It's around Halloween. And
Spooky season is up. And we thought, you know what? The Walking Dead is kind of making a little bit of a resurgence. It's on Netflix again, and so people can see it. And the comics are like pretty much evergreen. Yeah.
Like, he just ended the run a little while ago.
Yeah, it's probably within the last 2 years.
Yeah, something like that.
The show wrapped. The show's wrapped.
Yep, show wrapped up.
And now they're doing kind of spin-off shows from it as well. Spin-off shows, games, all that.
People
keep that Walking Dead going. Fandom. Yeah. The fandom never.
And there's
dies.
Walking Dead board games and all sorts of cool stuff.
Right.
But,
this is where it started.
But the exciting thing is the comic book first came out in October 8th, 2003.
Right.
And it felt like an underground comic a little bit. Mostly because there's no color, right?
Right.
I don't know if that's the feeling of it.
I was a wee young lad.
2003.
Yeah.
And, when you look it up too, it says readers quickly connected with Grimes as he struggled to keep his humanity intact. And that's like the whole point of The Walking Dead is like, when this does happen, or if this happens, the zombie apocalypse.
Yep.
It's just going to just be there. It's just going to happen, and the show and the comic continually refer to themselves at the humans as like, hey, once we make this choice or once we do this thing, we're not able to turn back, right? Like there's always this point where it's like, you're now going to be this feral, killer without remorse. And who wants to head down that road? And that's why it's like, we need to have some rules in place.
I guess, is this one of your like maybe favorite adaptations or favorite ways of thinking about a zombie apocalypse compared to some other things or movies you've watched?
I was particularly drawn to it. So, we watched Walking Dead on
AMC.
See. So when the comic came out, I think a couple of years in, I read like volume 1 or issue 1
early
or
on,
something. Yeah. And I read it as like a combo, like a issue 1, 2, 3 combo or something like that. I never actually had issue number 1, which actually became quite valuable.
Darn it.
But yeah, so I read it and I was like, well, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And then when the show came out, because then it started gaining popularity as a comic. But I mean, the show came out in 2010.
Yeah. So it was almost like 10 years.
Yeah.
later.
It was like a good 7 years of the comic before
Which
it
makes
even came
sense.
a show.
I mean, some things take off in a direct to live adaptation right away.
Yeah.
But a lot of things, it takes a good 10 years.
I do remember at the time
adapt.
that the popularity of it was really based around the whole like not knowing why it happened, not knowing what time of like the century it was happening. Like, is this the 80s? Is this like early 2000s? Like, is this modern day or is it like 10 years?
That's true, because when we read it, you don't really get a huge sense of
and
the
then
year.
it just happens. And it's kind of cool that the comic just opens like that. And so does the show. And then people are like, oh my gosh, like if this was tomorrow, like what would I do?
Right. Because the story starts as Rick waking up after the apocalypse happens. The zombie apocalypse happens.
Yeah, like he's a cop.
Yeah.
He's a sheriff.
Like he has like one incident the night before, gets knocked out, wakes up, it's like, where's everybody?
And like while he was in the hospital, the zombie apocalypse happened.
Which wouldn't be the worst way to live through it the night of. You're like, I don't know if I gotta sleep through it. That's not the worst. But then you have all this. He had all this remorse.
Yeah,
coming out of it. And how does he deal with it? How does he find his family? How anything? So he was really lucky, I think,
Yeah.
to
I
even
mean,
find his family.
I do like that the first issue is mostly him
Yeah.
as through our eyes, right? Like there's
Right.
always this sort of
To audience. Yeah.
the character that is the audience, right?
Right.
Like, you see through, and so he becomes us, and like you're just like, what's in that field over there? Okay, walk over there. Okay, what's happening in this car? Okay, go to the car. Like
Right.
you sort of start rooting for
Yeah.
how you would react, and it's well paced, it's well done. I mean,
Yeah.
Robert
absolutely.
Kirkman. So I heard a funny interview from Robert Kirkman.
Okay.
Because we're rewatching The Walking Dead at home, and so we're a little beyond this compendium. But Robert Kirkman said he went to Image and said, "I've got an idea for a comic," and he sat down and he did his elevator pitch on this comic idea. And he said he never said zombies. He just never wanted to say it. He just said Walking Dead, biters,
Right.
crawlers.
Yes, because he doesn't really use the word zombie.
undead. Yeah, they don't even use it in the show and
Yeah.
stuff. It's just not a thing. So he was being very vague about it. And Image was like, but like, like, why are they here? Like, how did that happen? What brought this on? And they said, we need something else. We need like space or aliens or something like that, and like an identifiable
Sure.
catalyst.
Yeah.
And Robert Kirkman was like, yeah, it's aliens. They did it. They came down and it's aliens.
Oh my God.
And then they were like, cool. And they greenlit his book and they got Walking Dead going. And Robert Kirkman said, I never brought up aliens again. I just I
Just for the
wanted the
pitch.
book made.
Right.
And
You
they
wanted
were
that
like,
bad. Yeah.
Yeah. They're like, oh, aliens, awesome. And he just dropped that and never went back to it, because you can have some things in comics and in stories where you don't have to explain it.
Right. Because I guess if you look at other adaptations or other series, movies, things like that, you do have to have some of that mysticism that goes along with it.
It's like a research
like the Evil Dead
or
series. That's kind of like its own vibe of like comedy horror.
Mm-hmm.
If you look at like the Dawn of the Dead, that's
Yep.
probably one of the bigger like series.
Yeah.
That's more of a
Even the one
serious
with
vibe.
Will Smith, it was like
Okay. Oh, I Am Legend, I think.
Yes, it's
that
like
was a little bit.
made in a lab kind of stuff. People do
Mhm.
want to know like what's the backstory. So I mean,
that's always
a
the
good
best thing to
draw.
keep in the back of your pocket as a writer.
Yeah, I'm not telling you everything. But yeah, it was.
Yeah.
I think it was a really fresh take on a very familiar theme.
Right.
So it's kind of like when people write about vampires and stuff.
Yeah,
in a
and
new
I mean this is
light.
even before like Last of Us. Like that's a
Yeah.
hugely like popular like video game adaptation series, but that's even before this. So
Yeah, I mean this very quickly gained popularity. And I
Right.
could see where
and it's been over 100 issues, I believe. Yeah, easily.
I mean, we didn't know if it'd ever end, right? Like,
Yeah.
and then he just sort of ended it, I think is what it was. So
yeah.
so the comic has wrapped up, the show has wrapped up, but it's still like we said, it's still really kind of nice to go back into it and see where it all began. We've done that a lot on the podcast where we go back and find out exactly what was the origin story, so to speak. I mean, this is the origin story of a really popular TV show.
193 issues.
That's a lot.
Yeah, and it says here, October 2003, and the series concluded with issue 193 in July of 2019.
Wow. 16-year run
Yeah, that's crazy.
by the same author, different
Yes.
artists, but same author.
Right. Yeah. And for other purposes, of the podcast, we're going to keep to the compendium. I believe this gets to season like 4 or 5 in the show. This covers all the way up to the governor, and the governor, but doesn't go to like the aftermath of his dealings.
Yeah, it stops with the governor storyline in the show.
Yep.
And then when they move on from that,
Yes.
that must be compendium 2.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's 4 compendiums all together.
And each one's about 1,000 pages.
Yes.
Or so.
But we did it. I think we read it about, I don't know, I read it about 2
Couple
weeks.
Yeah, it's a
good.
good read.
Yeah. I mean, if I had the motivation to read chapter a night, it would have been great. Because I read the first chapter in one night. I was like, oh, cool. I can do this every night. And you can get pretty close. We did say each chapter in the compendium is about 6 issues in one. Because the compendium covers 1 through 48. So we had to do the math because it's not divided in like single issues. So we were trying to do that. And
They
we were
just
about
divided into chunks.
There's 8,
Things.
yeah, 8 chapters. So
somewhat of general storylines.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, they weren't very abrupt when they ended. I think it was very purposefully like thought out that way, which is nice. Yeah. And so the main character we follow is Rick. He was a police officer, and I believe this is the South. Yeah, because he's outside of Florida.
Yeah,
if I remember
well, in the show, see, that's another little thing. In this, he's in Kentucky.
But
then
okay.
in the show, he's more like in Atlanta, Georgia.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And they go to Atlanta in here. So
they always talk about going to Atlanta.
Yeah, so it's generally the South.
Yes. So that was interesting. So you might hear us say it a lot of times on the show, and you can keep track at home of how many times well, in the show this happened, and then the comic this happened.
I mean, so the cool thing is when
we have that retrospect though.
Yeah. I mean, you have both sources, right? And when they make a TV show, either they connect with the fans or they really ostracize the fans, right? But for this one, the general, like if you were to sort of do a big umbrella of the series and say, okay, this one is Rick finding his family, and then this one is Rick going finding the prison, and like generally the storylines follow exactly right. But the intricacies, the little tiny character writing, and like who sort of gets involved with who, and why do their personalities,
all the relationships,
and like what's their backstories, and even like do they want to shoot guns and kill zombies? Like they've kind of muddled a lot of that in from one to the next. But I think the comic has solid reasoning on why they took the route they did with the characters.
Because they try to pose 2 options typically of like, A, we could kill it, or B, we could. Let's see what happens if we don't. Oh no, we're going to.
Well, and some of the show, like in the show, there's characters that are not in the book, and in the book, there's characters
we were talking about that in the pre-show. Like tell some of the characters,
like
that
Merle and Daryl. who are probably Daryl Dixon's super popular in the show.
Yeah, like that's Norman Reedus's character. Yeah, Daryl.
And Daryl was made entirely for the television.
Yeah, which I was mind blown in the pre-show. I'm like, what?
Yep. They just kind of came up with him and said he'd be a good character on the screen.
Right.
Which is true, because in the comic too, I feel like there's a lot more people in the comic. Like there's
I feel like it.
NPCs all over.
Yes. There are lots of NPCs. If you think about it that way. And he definitely runs into a lot of people, and he's trying to build up a community of trusted individuals that can look out for each other, help take care of each other. Relationships are born out of it. And how do you rebuild your community after an apocalypse happens? Well, you're starting from back one. First, you want to find your immediate family, and then you want to find who are you safe with and others like it. And that's kind of the premise of how he starts off.
Yeah, and in like any sort of typical group, even like D&D groups and everywhere else, you've got people who have skills, and so you're like, okay, I need you because you
exactly. I think of Glenn. Yeah, Glenn was like that.
He's got a skill; he can get in and out.
Yep, absolutely. And was it Dale? Dale's another big figure, and he had the RV, so he had their mode of transportation.
Well, and he was like a knowledgeable sort of mechanic too.
Right. He had a lot of like street skills.
And then Rick and Shane are police officers, so they're sort of like the tanks.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything goes back to D&D.
Yeah, you get them up front, and you're okay. But they also are the ones to kind of see things more black and white. Like they're the ones who just make a decision and they just do it and they act
right.
And their decision is always based on where is the threat, like
Mm,
we need to get rid of the threat immediately.
sure.
And
Yeah. Whether it was external from the group or internal
yeah,
for that matter.
right. Well, and a lot of it then boiled down to, Rick is keeping us alive, so we're going to do what Rick wants, right?
Hmm.
And you just have to kind of watch that sort of power doesn't corrupt idea,
Yeah.
because
Oh,
it
and that's a whole
does.
nother thing was
Yeah.
the pressure of being the leader when he's never had that. He had a little bit of that responsibility as a police officer. And he goes on to say that in the book is like, I had a little bit of it. I barely shot a gun.
Yeah.
And now I have to do it every day at every hour of every minute. I have to be constantly making decisions. And there's a point where he can't necessarily handle it. And he has to like readjust really hard. And the whole group is like, whoa, man, nope. Go chill out for a little bit.
Well, and like the hardest thing too is that you can see how just overwhelming emotionally this is,
Oh, yeah, even reading.
but also like after a while it's like, where do you go and what do you do? And like, and then
Yeah.
you just quickly realize that people are probably the biggest threat, like other people.
Right. And I will say it's probably for pacing wise, it's good to read a chapter and set it down
Mm-hmm.
and then come back to it and read it again, like the next day, next night. I did that so I could kind of absorb what I
Mm-hmm.
read and have some retention of it. Maybe look a little back a little bit when I go back to pick it up, but that way I didn't lose the meaning of what they're trying to convey. The only time I really binged it, I think, was the last 3 chapters. Was like the calm before the governor attacks them, when the governor attacks, and then
Well, and
we'll
so
break that up later. But
yeah, I
yeah,
mean, I will say one thing. So like the beginning of the comic, you're just sort of stumbling into one event after another, right? And so like
right,
you're trying to figure out,
like the
is there
rules.
anywhere that they can just rest, like stop for a
Yes,
minute, right? It's nonstop. It's
yeah,
just
up until
one
they
thing
get
to the
to their
next.
first. I think the first house, like when they get in the house. The
Yeah, and they
houses.
try to say
That's
like,
probably their first checkpoint outside the RV.
well, then you
Yeah, because
realize
that's their
like,
first
is this the
outside.
best way to do this? Like, should we camp and just hold our ground?
Mhm.
It's like they do that in the show a lot too. Is like, are we better off making like our own bunker, or are we better off just always staying on the move and just always
Right,
being
kinda
ahead?
being a nomad.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
like trying to do like a quest, like we
Yep.
should get to this city, or we should.
Yeah, it
That's
reminded me
always
of a
their
video
first.
game, and then here's a rest
Yeah,
checkpoint, save.
yeah, and then it's like you're safe for 6 hours. Okay, time to move,
Mhm.
and you're just constantly going to the next, and they're trying to think of like, where is the best place to go? Like, is the big city the
Yeah,
best way to go? But then you do realize that
yeah.
going to the cities is pretty much just a death trap, because
Yeah.
what ends up happening, even I think Glenn was the one who said it, that everyone just ended up clustering together, and then there was
Mhm.
food for everyone turning into zombies, and then they turned into zombies,
Yeah, because it
so
was kinda
it's
like
not
that
good.
was the government's first action was everyone headed to cities, because it was supposed to be, like, where they could keep everyone safe,
And they
and
just thought it was
that
a fever, so it's just like they just
yeah.
thought that's what it was.
Yeah, and then it turned out it was the exact opposite. So everybody kind of in the rural side of things was actually better off.
Yeah. So the really cool thing is that all of the characters that people really connected to, like Glenn and Rick
Mhm.
and Lori and like,
Yeah.
Carl, they're all in the comic. So
Yes.
part of that building this world, they stayed true to that, and they knew
Yes.
that that they're not going to mess with too many characters. But when they're kind of going through each storyline,
Yeah.
I could see where they would like, how can we mix this up a little bit? What
Mm.
would be a better way to rebuild this story into a more engaging storyline? Where like, because some of
Okay.
these plots that are in the show versus
Right.
the comic,
Mhm.
some of the plots in the comic are 2 or 3 pages long. And it's like,
Yeah.
here's a conflict. Okay, it's resolved. Where
Sure.
in the show, it takes 2 or 3 episodes.
Mm. And
So
for me,
pacing
as
wise is
a
different.
personally, coming back to the series, I like reading this.
Yeah, it's
because I
exciting.
have like
It's exciting.
the exactly, and then you can kind of do your own pace, but you also get to absorb it just a little bit better, so you can pick it up the next night.
Mhm.
But then also like it's not a whole 45 minutes spent on one thing. You're kind of bouncing around to either that location, different characters in that location, and or you can focus in on more of those ideas and thoughts. Whereas the show, you might who knows what that episode's gonna bring about,
Yeah.
and you have to really
Anxiety.
commit anxiety, and then you get more anxiety about watching them. I don't a little bit during the comic, but like that shows like good character
Mhm.
investment if you're really tied to somebody. I think it might be easier in the TV show to get tied with a character, especially if you're spending 45 minutes an episode,
Yeah.
or 20 minutes an episode.
So that's kind of like our hot take on at least like the general overall feeling of the comic. I think the other part of it is if you're a fan of just looking back on some of this pop culture
Mhm.
that has really exploded, where did it start from?
Right.
And Robert Kirkman, he had a great idea.
Yeah.
He was a co-creator with Tony Moore.
Mhm.
And it was funny because we were like, I know that artist. So without getting into whatever
Drama.
rights and drama that happened outside of the comic, we'll just stick to the comic.
Yeah, we'll
Tony
keep
Moore-
the drama in the comic.
Yeah. Tony Moore is a penciler, inkler, and gray tones. So he was the one who helped sort of set the images.
Art style? Yeah.
that
Art style,
you'd
maybe
see.
character designs.
And yeah, it's just so people could carry on with that. He has a very unique art, I think, look to him.
yeah, it's
It's very
really
expression, a lot of
yeah.
expression,
It is absolutely. Yes, if
and
you
like 20% cartoony, like a little
yeah.
goofy, but not too bad.
His environments are pretty good. His attention to details very well.
His characters are always moving very exaggerated. They're always
Yeah.
like throwing their hands out or like making
Right.
sort of scary faces, but
yeah,
or surprised expressions.
Sure.
He tries to, I think, lay out the page where
hmm
you see their faces first and
Yeah.
foremost, right?
I think you're right. I think he has a lot less dialogue in his early beginnings and stuff.
Yeah, you're just sort of
This
seeing what the
paneling's a
world
little-
has turned
yeah.
into. The world is
Right.
just like everywhere you look is just zombie.
hmm
Puts it into perspective for everyone just to get a feel for too.
Right.
But Tony Moore, he started off doing the compendium. He did 6 issues,
Yeah,
did chapter
chapters
1.
1 through 3 in this here.
and then
Oh no, he did chapters 1.
chapter 1.
Yeah.
And then it says Robert Kirkman was a letter.
Letter 1 through 3. That's why I was getting confused.
After a while, I was like, oh,
Oh.
that's hard work.
Right.
So it looks like he hired Russ Wooten to do the rest.
Yeah.
But Tony Moore, great comic artist. After this, he moved on and did Fear Agent. Fear Agent is another awesome comic.
Yeah, we reviewed we did a podcast episode way
Early
back in the
on.
time machine.
Back in the day.
But yeah, when you said that, now that I look at like Rick's design, I'm like, yeah, that's totally dude from Fury.
Yeah, it's totally him.
Now that's a space thing. That's his alien space
there you
thing,
go.
right? He's like, well, I'll use that like design.
That's
from-
Tony Moore's space thing. But Tony is great. We loved Fear Agent. It's a lot of fun. And
Yes.
actually, it is a good story because it deals with time travel and all sorts of cool, wacky stuff.
Right.
I could see where he branched out on that. So that's
Yeah.
cool. We're happy about that one.
Yeah.
But for The Walking Dead, I think once they got their look, which was very like staunchly like, we're going to stay black and white no matter what.
Yes, this is
You
an.
know?
I would think it's an entirely black and white comic book series. Because
Yeah,
if
I
you
don't-
started out this way, I don't know why you would go to bed color. But
I don't know if like the compendium 2
Yes.
or 3 or 4, like if there maybe did a splash of color somewhere.
oh sure,
But
right. other than
I-
the covers, yeah.
I just don't see them ever getting away from it. And actually, it helps the story be staying black and white.
Yes, you
it
can
helps-
kind of take away some of those stigmas too.
Yeah, it helps you keep in like, okay, this is a horrific,
Right.
terrible future
Mm-hmm.
or present or whatever.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, we were kind of talking about it earlier. It was like it's more like a story about humanity with a zombie apocalypse around it.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not so much about the zombies, biters, walkers, whatever you want to call it, It's not so much about them dealing with the zombies. It's more like, okay, it happened. How are we reacting to it? How are we building up civilization, humanity? How are relationships and ethics and morals going? Changing and adapting.
Well, and like just because you're a group, so to speak,
Mhm.
it doesn't mean that you guys are, thick and thin together forever.
Nope.
And that also is, I think, an overarching theme in this book of if you don't have anything to add as far as value to the group and you become expendable, then you will just be expendable,
Is that why they call
Uh,
it The Walking Dead?
I don't know. It's like you're already dead. You're just walking
Right.
around. Like you're already-
That's like the throwback to, or the reference we seen. What was it at the end of chapter 3?
Yeah,
It's like, we are the Walking Dead.
we are.
And
That's
Rick
who
has
we
this whole
are.
speech about it. And he's like, well, we're already dead. We're just living every day as our last kind of deal.
Yeah, and I mean, on one end of
Trying to
it,
build a future.
they
up
really
ahead.
push like, how long can you do this? How long
Survival.
can you live in this world?
Right.
Would you, if the whole world turned upside down, would you just stay just to survive?
Mhm.
And then on top of that, they do a few scenes where people do get bit or shot or like, I'm
Yes.
going to die. Like they weren't dead yet. They're just like, I'm going to die. I
Mhm.
have this bad wound, right?
Mhm.
And so then they always kind of come back to this moral ambiguity of like, so if you're not going to make it, should we like finish you off now?
Right.
And then at that point, are you just killing a living person?
Yeah.
Because they're like, well, no, they're going to turn into a zombie. So then do they wait until they turn into a zombie
and then
kill them? Because
Yeah.
then they're like, now you're a zombie and I have no remorse to do that.
Exactly.
So it is a weird, like, if someone's slowing you down or if they get injured and you're like, you're not going to come out of this, like at what point do you as a human say, I'm going to finish this,
right.
where you are not now
Do you want to
carrying
go
this
out in your
guilt?
own terms, or
Yeah.
do you rather write it out in a blaze of glory and
and
do it that way?
do you feel like you're going to be a zombie, so I'm going to help you? It's just, it is hard. And he pushes that theme
a
a
lot.
Yeah, a lot.
Absolutely.
He runs into, like, you go into a house and you see like past families. You go into another area and you just see like
right,
mass graves. And
yep.
it's just
And
hard.
then there was like, I guess there's another character we reference, Herschel. Herschel was like, he is very man of faith, and he's like, hey, I don't feel like I want to end these zombies' lives. I'm going to put them in my barn.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? Oh, that's a different perspective. And Rick is like, what? Dude, there's no coming back. But you don't know that there's no cure for this. Are you just, what if there is? If somebody comes out, if the army comes and says, hey, here's the cure, we're going back to normal. You're doing all that for point. It's not making any sense. And so that's the other, they expose those scenarios. Or like, what was it? The governor had his daughter in a room, and you're like, oh, that's weird.
Yeah. It is.
So he definitely plays around with, okay, you as a human have like a family or moral ethics. How do you encounter those when somebody or personally, or as a man of faith or whatever, turns into a zombie?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that as
And
a character?
it is cool that
individual
Robert Kirkman has enough of like a writing palette to just bring these scenarios up and just say, hey, what if this happens? What if that happens?
He probably has a whiteboard when he started out. And he's like,
this be
what
cool?
if
That'd be
this?
cool.
What if that? What if that? And he probably got to work at a lot
He's
of
got
those.
all these ideas of like, when can I start this?
Yes.
I also think as far as like cinematic quality in the comic, like where is the action and where is the drama and where's the suspense?
Yeah.
He does a good job of that. He's a very
It's
skilled
very
writer. Very
balanced. I would say it's very balanced. It's more on the drama side than the action side, but I think that's what he wants.
Yeah, and at the same time, you are rooting for them, but then you realize
there's a ton of build. If you
choices.
think about it, there was a ton of build to go into some of these major action scenes.
Yeah, and it's like, are they going in the right direction? Like, do you feel
Yeah.
like you're like, oh, this isn't going to be good. This is going to be good.
Right.
You want them to survive. You want them to do good.
Succeed.
But you also realize that the whole world now is totally backwards. So there's no safety really anywhere. And that's what he just paints it as. He's like, these are just people who have found their way to each other. And there's just no ground that they can say, hey, we finally made it, right? Like they're always looking for that.
Right.
They're always looking for that next, like the grass is greener,
Right.
And it's like, oh, they made it. And then, oh, no, that didn't work. Okay. Now, okay. Oh, they made it. Oh, half of them died. Okay. It's like, right. Oh, they made it.
And that's another thing I think that show really pushed when the show came out. And it was probably prevalent in the book as it was coming out too, but no character is safe.
Yes.
Because not a lot of series you can say is the character is not going to come out of this alive or severely changed and things like that. Like a Superman comic, Superman's going to save the day.
He's gonna
Batman's going to he's gonna maybe have a little difficult time, but he will come back at the end of the day, pretty much back.
Well, it's funny you mention that because now I'm thinking when people die in this comic, I mean that's it, like forever. Where like everyone jokes about the superhero deaths that they always come back, right? Like they're like, oh, dying in comics,
except the Marvel villains, they will never come back.
Dying in the comics isn't the same, they'll figure it out a way. But there's no way to just figure this out.
Now, wasn't that more of a prevalent thing in the show where a character died off screen, maybe, or something like that, or maybe they're dead, but you didn't see a body? So it might be morally like.
I just remember like you would say, oh, I have to literally see it happen. Right.
I remember like their like fan shows, like after the episode's over, like we didn't see him die.
Nope. And
so he might come back.
Yeah, that was
Talking Dead. I think it called it. I forget what the host's name is now.
Yes,
I could see him.
Me too.
Yeah,
and it was exactly that. They had another show to talk about it because when the show was on TV. That's what we were saying earlier. It came out once a week, so you had to wait a whole week to see the next episode. And then in the middle of the season, so they had like 16 episodes, and then the middle of the season on episode 8, it was always a cliffhanger, and then you have to wait a whole month before the next.
Chris Hardwick,
yes. So you had to wait a whole month.
Hope he's doing okay.
In the middle, and it's like, man, I remember losing their minds.
Yes,
and I also do remember very distinctly that people were like, I can't believe that happened. I can't believe that happened. And comic readers were like, well, yeah, of course that happened. It's in the comic. But I think they changed enough of it where even comic readers were surprised by the changes.
Sure.
But yeah, in the comic, I mean, going from one scene to the next comic, one sort of arc to the next, they did a great job of just holding to their, strengths.
Yes.
I think they didn't really try to get too far away from the storyline and like make it, they had this sort of magic stew and they stayed with it, you know?
Yeah.
And one of the bigger surprises is that Rick, and you can see it in the covers and stuff, but Rick loses his hand.
Spoilers.
Yeah, it's okay. We won't tell you how.
We haven't did too many spoilers on the show, but
we won't tell you how. But he loses his hand.
Yes,
and you can see
He's
it in
missing
an
an appendage.
Yes. So in the comics, very easy to draw and just have him as missing his hand, right? But in the show, they decided not to do that. And
so we were kind of talking about that as how difficult will that be to cover up your right hand every time you do an episode.
Yeah. And so like maim one of your lead actors. That's the hardest part, I think, is to say, okay, now I'm limiting my strength. And part of Rick, even in the comics, Rick's strength is that he never stops. Like he is just always on. He's always looking out for his
entire
family.
Tell him, chill.
Yeah.
Chill. We got this.
He's just constantly striving to make sure everyone survives. And he feels bad when they don't, but I mean, he's got to put his family first. He's always thinking about that portion of it. The other thing too is so they get to the governor. They do find the governor. The people of the show will recognize that. I always thought it was kind of neat too that they wear the riot gear, the bulletproof vest, a lot more in the comics.
Oh, really?
They hardly wear it in the show. Like they have it here and there, but like they've always have it on.
It's more of a protection plot device that says, hey, the character is a little more safer.
Yeah, like he can get like a lot of them get shot at and bullets are just bouncing
Yeah,
off of them. And I'm like,
right.
oh, that's something.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a cool way to think about it. I mean, how much more resistance can we give to our one of some of our main characters that we
Yeah.
like as they're going to go fight zombies or
Well, and they
go
use
on
it
this mission.
part of the story is so you don't know who's in there and stuff. They kind of like make it another suspense line.
Sure.
But also, so we didn't talk about Michonne. Michonne is
I guess
in here.
So let's go as we do that. Let's go over like some of our favorite characters or things like that, or anything like else dynamic that we thought. So Rick kind of stayed true, except for like the hand thing.
Mhm.
Was Lori pretty much very similar?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much back and forth a little. The whole like Shane thing
Yeah.
was drawn out a lot longer in the show.
Oh,
Like
okay.
Shane was there many episodes.
Okay.
In the comic, it kind of gets wrapped up, I think. Pretty early on.
Yeah, I mean it did, and then because he passes on, he go bam, oh he's gone. But that kind of happens, and then they're like, we're not gonna, like, are we gonna talk about? No,
Yeah,
I don't want to think about it until they are at the prison, until they are off by when the potential baby is born, and then you're like, well.
I mean, Lori's pregnant in the show.
Yeah.
She's pregnant in the book.
Okay.
And Carl is a great character.
Yeah.
One of my,
Carl,
I
yeah.
think in the comic, surprisingly, one of my
Yeah.
favorites is Andrea. Like she's really,
Andrea's cool.
she really
Mm-hmm.
is different from
Yeah.
the show. I think they
Okay.
wrote her well in the comic. She's
Good.
very different in the comic.
Okay.
Like very drastically different. So,
Okay, interesting.
so if you liked Andrea in the show, I think you really, really, really like her in the comic.
Yeah.
Carol is not quite developed in the comic than the show.
She has a
kind of-
lot more when
kind of a
her
floater.
a little bit more of a floater, absolutely, after her like main love interest dies. She kind of floats and has this moral she loses actually her morality of like, I don't know what I meant to do anymore.
Yeah.
And she loses her compass,
Yeah,
essentially. And that's her
that's a good way
ultimate
to say it.
downfall. Yeah.
And Tyrese is in here.
Yeah,
and Herschel's
Tyrese
in
was
there.
probably my favorite character because he grows so much as a character throughout the series. I was like, that's pretty impressive.
He was well written. I mean, he had a
Yes.
lot of good moments. So
yeah, I think he was well thought out and developed. And
if you get a lot of,
because he's the great, like, as a buddy cop to
Mhm.
Rick, but also like challenging Rick all the time. Not all the time, but like, I'll support that decision. But I'm like, when he's got to check him a little bit, he's like, yo,
Yeah.
think about it for a
Yeah.
minute.
what was it? Alice is in there.
Yeah, Alice is
Amy.
in there. Yep.
Amy is Andrea's sister.
Yeah, all of
So-
the when Herschel comes along and his entire family gets mixed in,
Yeah,
the group essentially doubles.
Yeah, it's a lot.
I feel like, and so a lot of those characters either they stand their ground, they're there till the end, or they're.
And then of course, they run into other characters
Yeah.
that are issues. I mean, the governor in the comic is.
I think he is set up to be the villain.
Yeah, like he's over the top in the comic.
Yeah,
He's a
but
lot.
you have to make him the exact opposite of Rick.
Yeah.
Because I think that at least that's what I got out of the governor was, that courageous, brave. They both have leadership qualities, but the governor does it out of fear. Rick does it out of survival and trying to guide this community again. And I would say
It's a good way to put it. One's out of survival, one's out of just like
fear,
the fear of losing
fear and power. Yeah.
power. Yeah, like so he does things where he keeps people just enough questioning, like, gosh, should I be following him or not?
Right, because they did like the fight arena because they thought that'd be the entertainment. And I'm like, no.
And he just has enough like he sort of screams the loudest and he has a big
Yes.
persona, so he
Right.
just overshadows a lot of people.
Mhm.
But then when he really gets into like fights, did you notice he's not very good at that?
No, he is
so
not a
he's-
fighter at
so
all.
he just like kind of talks a big game,
Mm-hmm.
but his game is like super lethal. So it's
Right.
like
Some
he
of
talks
those
a big game, but he'll like
dictator clause. I'm like,
Yeah, he'll
instantly. Yeah.
instantly kill you. So I was like, oh,
Yeah. Which is the exact opposite of I think of Rick. So that makes him a good villain.
Yep.
I do think that makes him a good villain
And
for.
the whole scene, like with the governor and Michonne, and like,
Yeah, when
oh, that was
Michonne comes along, I
Michonne
thought
was a
that
little
actually
crazy.
gave a nice way to break up the group a bit because everybody has their own skill.
Yes.
There are fighters in the group, but she is coming at it from a completely different angle of, hey, she's kind of been surviving on her own for a while, and she is kind of very alone, like very lone one wolf pack, whatnot.
And she
So
does have her sword.
she
so of
does have
course
her
she's a-
sword, pretty, on true for that. So when she comes along in the group, she kind of lets her guard down a little bit. She starts to feeling some sense of community, but it's hard for her to express herself, which
Mhm.
that kind of was communicated in the show very well. So I was like, wow, it's cool that they nailed that off the bat. And I look forward to like seeing her character grow and things like that because she's a pretty big character going now.
Well, and she also
And she doesn't even get involved like till 3/4 of the way
no,
through
I
this
was gonna say
compendium.
she also is kind of a newer character, so she really added another dynamic to the group.
Mm-hmm.
And then she also really, really gets like um really beat up by the governor, and just sort of like her storyline with that was like,
Very
yeah, it was like,
traumatic. Yeah.
tough, right? So
Yep.
then when she got out of that, you're like, man, this is now like really, really about survival, like survival no matter what, like
Yeah.
what lengths will you go? And that's where it started turning into
Because
is
then it gets personal for
yeah.
him.
And if they're ramping the comic up that high, it's
Yep.
like, how could you ever come down from that level, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
But I think it just showed too, because this is that's probably about issue, I don't know, 30 or 35 or something.
Sure.
I mean, it's in there somewhere.
Yeah.
But it's showing that they've been in this now for over 2 years. The comic has
Sure.
grown and evolved.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure that Robert has figured out his audience and figured out what's people are responding to.
Sure. And I
and
mean, it's kind of wild to think that this was a Image Comics published book.
yeah,
Because
true.
it's they don't really have a lot of series that they're known for being this long with this much scope. And it probably
TVMA pretty much, right?
yeah, it is pretty kind of more serious core. But I mean, yeah, I wonder, it probably did pretty decent numbers for him and things like that, and really got that popularity going from. I think this really established him on the scene as a writer. Kirkman probably, yeah,
easily
because he would
'Cause
go
then now
from
he's
this
like,
to Invincible,
yep.
and
And then he became like a partner of Image.
And then
so he's
because now he's if you look on the beginning of the cover,
He's listed in
he's
there.
listed in as Robert Kirkman, Eric Larson, Todd McFarlane, Mark Silvestri, Jim Valentino. Those with Skybound. Oh yeah, so he's the CEO of Skybound Entertainment, and then there's some other people. But the being saying I'm the CEO of a publishing like outlet of Image, that's huge.
Well, and Image's whole business model is that you are creator and you are
Mhm.
the owner of your work. So
Yeah.
they allowed Robert Kirkman to keep this as his creator owned property, and that's where he sort of built his strength,
Right.
where other comic industries would say, hey, you made this for us and now we're going to keep all the rights, all the TV shows, all of the extra spin-offs, all of
Mhm.
the board games and action figures and whatever.
Yeah, in the merch.
Yep. And so Robert Kirkman owns these rights. He made this
Yep.
is his. And while you're reading through it, I think the biggest strength with Walking Dead is that you get totally absorbed into the story.
Yes.
Where that's what you want. You want to like read comics and feel like you're standing right next to them.
Because that's true. As
listening
big
to
as
them
scope
talk.
as this comic is, it's very much more character, personal, like relationships.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yeah, then the baby is born. Judith is the same name as
Yeah.
the show. Judy, Judith, good job.
Oh,
and
okay. Yep.
Yeah, same name. And
Yeah.
I think that kind of developing the characters is like they'll develop the characters for an issue, and then something happens, and they'll develop these characters for an issue.
Right. Yeah. Because when
So
they
it's a
eventually
constant change.
they go from the house to from the farm to the prison, and then they have all those ethics of, wow, hey, we finally got to a safe place, but it's still we still have to clear out some rooms. There are still like what was it, 5 prisoners left over with morally questionable values.
Yeah.
Some are okay, some we overreacted to, but then because we overreacted, they kind of fell back on their old ways. It's not so good. But then that was like their biggest, like, and they tried to hold on to it as long as they could, and yeah, this had so many stories come out of it. It really just kind of writes itself sometimes.
It does. And, as far as like staying in the prison and, having that as a big part of the storyline, you kind of always knew that wasn't going to last. You like feel like, hey,
Yeah,
something's got to give, right? Like,
right.
and I think introducing the governor and introducing sort of the downfall of the prison was a great segue into, like, no matter how secure you feel you
Yeah,
are, you'll never be secure.
exactly,
Right?
because if you didn't do it, those characters would always feel safe, secure, and it would just be just regular drama all the time.
Yep.
So you have to find a way to keep the story moving and to keep the setting changing too.
But you're right. The last few episodes, or last few issues,
Yeah.
really a lot of adventure. Really, like, keep the action up. I could see where they stopped the compendium when they did, because it did come to a nice little, like, sort of tied down, like, arc.
Yes.
This sort of brings it all to a close, and
Yeah.
it was a good place to stop for the
Yep.
comics. And you're like, okay, now what's the next, big step, right?
Right.
But the governor in the comics is not to be trifled with. Definitely a great character. Yeah. Yeah, definitely a
Yep.
great character. Very, very huge moments. And Robert Kirkman knows how to make it cinematic, really,
Yes.
like how to pace these scenes
Yep.
out.
Yeah, people pick all their favorite characters, really follow them out. You can constantly debate if that was the right or wrong decision for that character. If they
True.
stayed, that character, Michelle wouldn't make that decision. Rick wouldn't do that. So why did they kill Shane off? Oh, Carl had every right to shoot Ty.
Yeah.
Like, oh god. But that's kind of the fun of it. And I was thinking, probably the last time I really debated somebody like that hard about like a series like that was Harry Potter, like stuff when it was coming out.
Yeah, where you're, really, really,
Because you didn't know everything that was going to happen, so everybody theorized
Yep.
that really went to all the lengths.
And
probably still.
you're invested. You're invested in the
Yeah.
characters, even though it's, just a comic. But at the same time, that's the idea, is that he was writing it to really get you connected to these people.
Exactly.
And, mission accomplished on that.
Yeah.
And then when you saw that there was a less than, perfect outcome, then you just knew. Okay,
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Less than perfect. Yeah.
Now who's next? Now who's next?
Mhm.
And in the show too, they used to do like a final meal for everyone. They did like a Last Supper. So when
I remember
Yep,
then the
remember
Talking
when-
Dead.
Yep.
Yeah.
And when your character died, it was like, okay, here's the Last Supper. And they all had a meal together, and they just
Yeah.
knew that it was like, you did a good run. And some characters were on since episode 1, and they were on a long time.
Right.
And same with the comics. You're reading the comics now, you're 800, 900 pages in.
Yeah.
And then someone dies, and you're like, man, that was a run.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I felt it. I think when Dale finally met his end, and I was like, oh man, not Dale.
Dale.
Dale, the lovable old man.
I do think that, like, Carl hasn't had as
No.
much moments in here that he did in the show.
I mean,
Carl had
okay,
a lot of, like,
but
good moments, but I mean,
yeah,
he's a good character.
He's a good character, and who knows? He was probably still developing him. Of like, he's still a kid. This very big thing happens in the first arc, and now he kind of gets pushed back.
Yeah.
Because they don't want him growing up too fast. Kind of like the classic Peter Parker Spider-Man problem of, we don't want to age him too fast.
Yes.
So, and there's tons of other children that he's supposed, like, what do we do with all these kids? Well, Carl's gonna be with them.
Yeah. There were a lot more kids in here than I remember.
Yeah.
And The other kind of like big part of it too is there's, I guess the
Yeah.
easiest way to say is that the storylines, the way that they happen, are purposeful and
Mhm.
sort of like planned. And I think everyone that had a death in the comic,
Yeah.
it got their moment.
They did.
You know, like it wasn't just sort of like the building exploded and then people died. You're like, no, everyone had like a cinematic,
Yep.
you know,
Really big moment.
memorable
Yeah.
send off.
Right.
And
Yeah.
while it was surprising, sometimes you're just like, oh geez, that just happened.
Right. I
That-
think like Tyrese like that.
yeah. And it really, a lot of those are like you trying to respond or react, but then you have to keep reading. It's like you can't stop, you have to keep reading. So that's the cinematic part of it, is that even though that one person
Yep.
had, came to the end, you're still reading it. And
Yeah.
he did a great, I don't know, the recipe for these books, I think, was followed by a lot of other writers and artists. They just thought, wow, if they can do it, why can't we? And I mean,
Yeah.
he redeveloped pop culture. really
Yeah,
is what
absolutely.
happened.
I think it says right on the front cover, the ultimate edition of New York Times bestseller. So, I mean, that really puts it up.
You did it.
You did it, and that's pretty cool to say you can. It, we do read a lot of Eisner winning books and whatnot, but like for a really long series like that, that's pretty impressive still. Like you got people motivated to read.
Or
read
even
watch.
just to break into the scene and say, I'm going to write a book about zombies. That's the hardest thing that happened.
Yeah. Yup.
So highly suggest.
Yeah.
Great read.
Absolutely. If you like this show, read the book. And if you are intimidated by just the length of 10 seasons to watch a show,
Yes.
read this, because this reads faster than watching the show. And you can kind of read it like if it's the compendium, you could read it just that first chapter. And then kind of keep going from there. You could read chapter to chapter in that way, or just read little bits. It's a little more easier to consume, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you read for a week and you've already made it through 3 seasons. You'll get through them. Don't worry.
Yup. And then you could be like, oh, I'll watch the show now. And then you go, oh, that didn't happen. Wait, that.
And tell them Bam Pow Comic Hour sent you.
Yes. All right. This is our 70th episode of Bam Cow Comic Hour.
70.
Exactly. And we have many more episodes in the can ready to go. And we can't wait for you to follow our journey with us. This is Andrew Garner.
And Chris Ramos.
Signing off.